So the research question now is, given the three options, these different designs, which one is better in terms of, maybe there are two objectives you could consider about regarding if you compare, right, these three different designs. First, throughput rate. Throughput rate, in other words, is the efficiency, utilization, right? Because if the throughput rate, of course, the throughput rate is kept by the total number of units you have in particular year, right? But if the throughput rate is low, which means many students may choose the private options, which means your student dormitory may not be able to fully utilize. So some stay idled. So throughput rate is certainly one objective. Maybe the system designer will put it in consideration. A second consideration is maybe you consider incorporated students' waiting cost and their matchness to their target. So then you could measure this as the total sum of the students' welfare, which is called social welfare. So that's another objective function, right? So we compare these two things, three designs in terms of throughput rate and social welfare. So that's the research question, which is better? Pooling, single listing, or multi-listing? Okay. And it's actually not very straightforward. You may consider multi-listing best because it allows the customer to the most flexibility of the options. I can choose either house, I can choose neither of them, I can choose both of them, right? But actually the comparison turns out not necessarily multi-listing is the best. Okay. So we will go to details. So before that, we were introducing our stylized model to capture the three systems. Okay. So this is the pooling system. So the customer, they are differentiated by a single parameter, which is their preference between Iona House or Thunderbird. Right? So Iona House is, if you really prefer Iona House, your parameter will be 0. If you really prefer Thunderbird, your parameter will be 1. What about the people in between? Then, like if the person is 0.4, which means he slightly prefer Iona than Thunderbird, but he's not that go to that extreme, right? If 0.5 means that he is basically indifferent between the two options. Okay, this is called the hoteling model, which is very commonly used to model a customer's choice. Okay, and all those customers, regardless their parameter, the parameter is not actually observed by the system manager, right? But they all join a single listing, a single queue, which is first come, first serve, a first come, first serve queue. And whenever there are two servers, because we model the available houses as for different buildings as a house. This is the Thunderbird, this is the Iona House. Right, this is student different two buildings of a student dormitory. After an exponentially distributed time, there will be a housing unit available, and this housing unit will be assigned to the first person and in the head of the line. But as we said, that person, regardless which option, he is not allowed to reject the offer of the house. Right? Okay. So if now this is available, this will go to this person take this house and leave. And then if the next customer may still this is available, then he take this house and leave. And the third customer take this and leave. So this is like a two server. We assume they have the same service speed, right? So the same number of house basically, same service speed, and they are serving for the same queue. So that's a single listing queue. Okay. Is there any questions for the design? Yes. The preference, in the allocation of the server, yes, it doesn't depend on your preference. Yeah, but later we can check what type of customer will get what type of units and what about their utility. We're going to check. But in the process, in the allocation of the housing unit, it doesn't matter their preference. Actually, it's not observed, right, by the system design. Okay, then this is the pooling system. The single listing system will have two separated queues. So customer with their parameters still, it's the same assumption. Customer have differentiated by a single parameter, which captures their preference between the two different types of service, right? Either Thunderbird or Iona House. And then the students can choose based on their parameter. Some will go, they choose this queue, some might choose this queue. And you will expect that the customer prefer Iona House will choose this queue, which is served by the Iona House. And the customer prefer Thunderbird will choose that queue served by the Thunderbird. Okay, and each server only serve the queue, right? That only serve one queue. So people in this queue will not receive a housing unit from Thunderbird. Okay. So that one you may prefer because that respect customers' choice. Right? The customers are allowed to make a choice. And once they choose this queue, they will never be offered with a house from there. From that perspective, it's good because it respects the consumer autonomy in their choice. But on the other side, with people we have been teaching queuing, right? Separate queue is not as good as pooling in minimizing waiting time. We have been teaching that, right? Because what will happen? It could happen that one queue is empty, the other queue has a lot of people. And in that case, this server is idled, which means the housing has been idled, right? And that results in efficiency loss, right? So that's a clear drawback of the single listing queue. So that is a fundamental trade-off between single listing and pooling, right? Pooling is more efficient in minimizing waiting time, but it's not good to respect people's choice. Single listing respects people's choice, but may increase congestion. And the last option is what we consider here, is called a multi-listing system. The multi-listing system still, the customer are parameterized by a single parameter of their preference between the two servers. And the customer really prefer Iona House would say this line is only served by Iona. And this line, if you are in this queue, it will only receive house from Thunderbird. But there is a middle queue. This queue said if you are not that have a strong preference, you could join that queue. This queue, you have to accept whichever type of service you received, right? So if you cannot make a choice. So if Iona give you, then take it. If Thunderbird give you, you have to take it and go, right? This is called the multi-listing system, multi-listing queue. So this is QA, QB, and we call this QR. That's the option you join the multi-listing queue. Basically, you click both. Right, in the questionnaire, you will say, oh, I can accept both housing types. And the last customer will say, and you could choose 0, which means you don't need either of them. You don't join the queue. You don't join either of the queue. So that's the multi-listing system. Any questions so far for the module formulation of the 3 different designs?
So I have a question about single listing. You mentioned that one might be empty, the other can be like congested.
Yes.
But in reality, people may look at the passive record of this acceptance rate. So if they say the acceptance rate of a certain housing is so low, they may hesitate.
So basically the mean service rate is the same. So if you said that the acceptance rate, everything will be same in the long run. The mean is the same. But it's because it's a stochastic system. Right, in the shorter term, maybe one is empty, one is longer, right? Yeah, so that's something stochastic that you cannot predict, right? On average, everything, the 2 queues are the same, asymmetric. Good question. So, okay, so then we talk about, let's say we have 3 different queues, and there are some slight nuance in the multi-listing queue. We have 2 more different models. One is that for the customer here, right? In the customer in front, if either server takes him, he disappears. This is called a cancellation upon service entry. Okay, and another is this person is actually served at both servers. Either server finish first, this job will disappear, and which means it will also cancel its copy on the other server. This is called cancel upon finish, right? So basically, cancel upon service, which means cancel upon finish. This cancel upon entry means both copies will disappear if one of them started the service. So it's just a small nuance, but we consider, but they will actually mathematically make a difference. for the multi-listing queue, right? We just measure here, listed here, and then the customer's utility. If you are a customer with parameter X, the X reflects your preference between these two different types of housing, right? So you have a utility V minus TX. V is the baseline, TX is the if you choose Q, if you choose the Q, the Iona house, right? So because X is the distance between you and 0, so that will be the utility you choose the AQA. If you choose QB, then it's T times 1 minus X. So if X 0, your utility of choosing A will be the maximum V. And then the utility you choose B will be V minus T, will be the smallest, right? So use this one to capture the distance between the either server. And then minus the waiting cost. C times the waiting cost. We assume WA, we formulate it as a Nash equilibrium. So WA will be at the equilibrium. What's the expected response time if you join QA? And we can solve the equilibrium by using these 6-point equations, right? So the arrival rate for each Q is the total arrival rate times the choice probability. The choice probability depend on, of course, the waiting time, right? So the customer see the waiting time of each Q, and then he will say, okay, which Q I want to choose based on his parameter X. If I basically compare these 3 options, the 4 options, and see which option gives him the maximal utility. So which is in the multi-listing case. If it's a single listing, you only have 3 options to choose. And if it's a pooling system, you only have the last 2 options to choose. Okay. So that we model the equilibrium of this multi-listing, the queuing system. And that allows us to compare their efficiency, throughput rate, and so on. So we are comparing the performance at the steady state. This is the literature review, right? Basically, I want to mention that this is I think we are able to derive this because the computer science people, I think there are some very good work. They recently make a breakthrough in deriving the waiting time expression for the waiting for this multi-listing system. So this W system, right? Or like 10 years ago, we don't know its closed form expression for its response time, expected response time. But since I think 2015, people derived this formula. So that actually facilitates our analysis. It used to be a very difficult problem, the W system. And okay, then let's start studying the equilibrium. So the single listing in the proper and the pooling, the equilibrium is very straightforward. I will not spend too much time. So basically for single listing, right? People on the very left-hand side choose QA. People prefer the other Q, will choose QB. Some people in the middle, they may balk. They may not balk, but they all may balk, depending on the parameters, right? So if very congested, then some people in the middle will balk because the people in the middle are like less enthusiastic towards both servers. So they are the people who most likely to balk. Okay, so that's a single listing. For pooling, all the customer will join the queue because they have the same utility. They don't know which server will be allocated. It's a half-half chance, right? So it's you actually the parameter doesn't matter. You just consider everyone join a single queue, and so that is the equilibrium. There will be equilibrium throughput rate gamma p, which means if there are more customers join than gamma p, then only a gamma p proportion of customer will join. Okay? So this is a classical like a characterization of queue with choice, because there will be like a threshold arrival rate, right? If more people come, then they will not join because it's too long. The waiting time is too long. Then that will scare people away, right? So this is the classical result from I was from 1969 because our work is also extension their result, not 1969. His and also has seen in Habib 2003 to Q and not to Q. Right, those are classical literature in studying people's queue joining behavior. But we extended them instead of a single queue, we extended them to like a multiple queue, and also we compare different queuing systems. Okay, so then we derive this is very expected result. We characterize the equilibrium structure. So at the equilibrium, how customer make a choice. So we find that in the single listing or in the single listing or pooling system, we already characterized. Very simple. For multi-listing, it's also straightforward, right? It's very much, I think, aligned with the expectation. People on the left join the QA. People on the right join QB. So those are people who prefer server B will join QB. And the people in the middle, either they join the multi-listing queue, or when it's congested, maybe some people join the multi-listing queue, some people may balk. Okay? So only the people in the middle will either balk or join the multi-listing queue, which makes sense. Right? If you are not that have a strong preference, you will most likely join the multi-listing queue. But if it's too congested, you may not join any queue. Okay? So this is the equilibrium calculation of the multi-listing system. So with this calculation, and we prove it's also symmetric. The equilibrium is always symmetric. What is symmetric? It means the Q, as you said, the QA and QB will have the same rate of arrival rate. That will be the same because we assume the arrival rate, the service rate is the same. Right? So it's not difficult to expect at the equilibrium, their arrival rate will be always the proportion of customers choose QA or choose QB will always be equal. Okay, so this is the characterization of the equilibrium, and then based on that, right, we can compare their throughput rate. We start with the easier case, CUS. CUS is the console upon service completion, as we said. Right, and we can then have these two. This is the theoretical results. We just draw a graph to illustrate the theoretical results, but this is proved, which basically means a takeaway message is the multi-listing is always the best option in terms of maximizing throughput rate. Okay, compare with single listing, compare with pooling. If you check here, right, if T is small, what means T is small? T is the parameter measuring the preference, how strong the customer's preference is. If T is small, which means customer not that different between the both servers, then it's mainly indifferent. In that case, basically pooling and multi-listing, they are perform exactly the same. They both dominate a single listing when gamma is large. And why? I think it's quite intuitive. Because when T is small, you consider the extreme case if T is 0, which means actually these two servers are indifferent. No one can distinguish these two servers. So in that case, there's no need to consider customer's choice. Because they are the same server, right? So in that case, pooling is of course the best because pooling minimizes waiting time, right? You increase the utilization. So pooling is always the best option when T is small. And it coincides with multi-listing. Because in the multi-listing queue, actually no one will join these two servers, these two sides, right? If T is very small, that also makes sense. Right? Because if you join QA, there's a risk you may miss a QB. But if the QA and the server B, server A and server A and server B are not really make a big choice, why I take a risk of only specify one choice, right? It's more safe to just join a multi-listing queue, then I can have access to both servers. Right? So in that case, no one join QA, no one join QB, or everyone join QA. Right? So that's for multi-listing reduced to the pooling system in that case. But if T is big, which means the two servers are very differentiated, and it make a big choice. In that case, you would expect a single listing can be better than pooling when gamma is large. And also in that case, multi-listing at the first, it coincides with pooling, it dominates single listing. But when gamma is larger, it coincides with a single listing and dominates pooling. Right? So this is but multi-listing is always better because it takes the maximum of either single listing and pooling. Right? This is the multi-listing curve. Okay, so the takeaway message is very clear. If you care about the throughput rate, you always choose the multi-listing. Okay. And if you do CUE, multi-listing actually will be strictly better than the other two. But the idea is the same, multi-listing always best. Right? So if, though I can tell the UBC, maybe dormitory manager, if they care about minimize the idle housing units, you don't want to like your housing units be idled. Actually, this may be from revenue perspective because the students pay rent. If you don't allocate out your student norm, basically you are losing money, right? If that's your objective function, you don't care about the student waiting cost, right? If that's your objective function, you always choose multi-listing, right? You could choose multi-listing. Okay. And then we could go to compare social welfare. What's social welfare mean here? Social welfare, first, it's the lump sum of everyone's utility. So remember, each student has a utility, which is I will not go back. So which is the utility, which includes the mismatch cost, right? If you are matched with the server you don't like, of course, there's a penalty. And then it minus the waiting cost, right? So the net utility of a customer is your baseline utility minus the mismatch cost minus the waiting cost. So basically, if you consider mismatch cost and waiting cost, then you sum up everyone's utility. That will be your social welfare, which I think has been documented in the literature. People have used that as a notation to compare different systems. And in terms of total utility, which means the social welfare, then the results are different. You see, multi-listing is not always the best option. It's always still better than pooling, but when gamma is large, single listing is better than multi-listing, which is true in either the three different models. No, regardless of T, right? Multi-listing is not as good as single listing when the system is very congested. You may wonder why, right? But you could consider that in the single listing, in the single queue case, right? In the single queue case, the classical results of 1969, they show that if you want to maximize the social welfare, you have to do what? Congestion tolling, which means it's best to scare some people away. You don't want everyone join, because if you at the equilibrium, what will happen? Everyone try to join a very congested queue, and everyone's surplus becomes zero, right? So that's not good. If you want to have a positive surplus, you must have a certain admission, like a cap. When the arrival rate reaches that cap, you said people you should not join, right? You prevent people to join when the queue is congested enough, right? So this is a very interesting results at the social optimal equilibrium. The equilibrium is at the social optimal, the queue length will be much shorter than the equilibrium queue length, right? Equilibrium queue length. So that's a classical result. And here, what we have is basically, I think, echoes this classical result. Multi-list is actually not good when the system is very congested. Why? Because it gives people an option to stay in the multi-listing queue. And those people actually, you don't wish them to join. When the system is already congested, right? I actually prefer some students to look for their private options. You think from the perspective of the system manager. If the system is very congested, first, I don't worry about the throughput rate. I know my house can be allocated out anyway. It's a very scarce resource. What I worried is the students all be like crowded, wait there for 1 or 2 or 3 years, right? Which is the case in many different universities, right? You have to wait 1 or 2 years until you get a student on, right? And then if that's the case, the system manager will think about it's best to discourage students from choosing the student option. Instead, I want to encourage students to choose outside campus option. Okay, how to do that? Don't provide the multi-listing queue, right? Either you very like Iona, you join this queue. If you very like Thunderbird, you join that queue. I will not try to cater. Some people said, oh, I'm indifferent of this queue. Just give them whichever server to me. No, I try to not limit the options. So then I can discourage people from joining the queue. Okay, so that's the key idea. Multi-listing, it sounds like it's very accommodating, but in that case, accommodating is bad. I don't want to accommodate you, right? So that's why multi-listing is actually not a good option. And similar from CUE. Okay, so this, and then so far we talk about equilibrium results. Nothing surprising, right? The last insights is a bit counterintuitive that the throughput that for social welfare maximization, multi-listing maybe not the best option, right? Okay, next we give you, I think, the most interesting results in this paper. We talk about the social optimal study instead of equilibrium. So now I assume the social planner can just say, you join that queue, you join that queue, as long as your utility is positive, which means we are looking for the first best situation that as long as individual rationality is satisfied, right? I don't need the incentive compatibility. So this is the social optimal. I can ask this person join that queue, as that person join that queue, as long as I guarantee you have non-negative utility. In that case, the social optimal structure will show at a certain parameters, it's asymmetric. Asymmetric. What means asymmetric? The QA may have a longer and the QB may be shorter, and more people join QA, less people join QB. And for the multi-listing queue, because more Thunderbird housing has been more people will join the Iona house, right? Less people join the Thunderbird house. So for people join the multi-listing, the probability of getting the two different service is not a half-half. Instead, for people join the multi-listing, most likely I will receive a Thunderbird house instead of Iona house. Because less people choose to join the Thunderbird the single listing queue. So there will be, you expect more Thunderbird house will be left over. Okay. So as a result, because that's public information, right? You know, if the multi-listing queue will most likely give you a Thunderbird house. So people who prefer Thunderbird will join the queue, and people who don't prefer Thunderbird will balk. So this is an asymmetric structure of the social optimum. So the social optimal in many cases are asymmetric. That's a very interesting result because you assume, first you assume everything is symmetric. The two queues, we already assume they are symmetric. They have the same service speed. And regarding customer choice, it's a symmetric preference, right? The same portion of people prefer 0, same portion of people prefer 1. Everything is symmetric, but the social optimal is not symmetric. Okay, so what's the intuition? What's the intuition behind that? Okay, so the social optimal, there are some cases that are symmetric, but there are some cases we prove it's always asymmetric. What's the intuition here? Basically, I want to create variation for the people in the middle to join the multi-listing queue. That's the key point. I don't want to half-half for the people who join the multi-listing. I intentionally create asymmetricity, asymmetry. And this asymmetricity will why it helps? It will make the differentiation between their utility, right? If everything is symmetric, what will happen? For people in the middle, their utility of joining the multi-listing queue will be all equal. Because you join the multi-listing queue, regardless your X is, your utility is always half times this server and half times this server's utility. So basically, it's a horizontal utility line. You see here, right? It's a horizontal utility line if the two servers are symmetric. But that's very bad. I don't want everyone have the same utility to join the multi-listing queue. Why? Because you can consider if the system is congested, what will happen? Yeah, as long as this utility is positive, people will join the queue. So in the end, at the equilibrium, if it's congested, this line will always have a height of 0, which means there's no positive surplus, utility surplus. Right? Everyone join the queue and get a 0. Okay? That's very bad. Right? There are no consumer surplus in the multi-listing queue. But if I make the line like that, which means people on the right will have a strictly higher utility to join the multi-listing queue than people on the left. That makes a difference because of this differentiation in the variation. Right? Only people on the right will join the queue, and people on the left, they will just balk. Right? So, but the people on the right, when they join, they will have a positive surplus. They will have a positive surplus. Right? So that I think is a very effective way to create a positive surplus instead of everyone like compete until their utility is all there. Okay. And this I think is and also very good in the in the society, right? If everyone's objective is the same, like everyone said, oh, what's the definition of success? I want to like publish many papers. Let's say. If everyone's objective the same, then it's terrible because everyone have to work so hard to publish papers. But it's good that some people prefer like publishing papers, some like going to skiing, right? That's good. Everyone pick their like, and the social utility is maximized. Okay, so then this is basically the social optimal result, and we could compare social optimal and equilibrium and see that what makes the difference. So basically, social optimal customer will overjoin the dedicated queue, which means at equilibrium, too many people join the over dedicated people queue than they should. Okay, so I will skip this result because for the time of interest, and then we will. I think how much time we have?
No,
we still have
20 minutes.
Okay, we still have some time. So there is, then we will talk about pricing, right? You may say that's the first better result, the social optimal. How you implement the social optimal in the practice. Because people will not really follow, you said you go to this queue, you go to this queue. That's not relevant because people will not do it in the practice. How to do that? We need to use tolling, right? Basically congestion pricing. So I charge a price if you join each queue. If you, let's say, if you want to apply for Thunderbird or apply for, Iona or apply the multi-listing queue, you must pay like a fee, admission fee. So if you do that, you could drive the equilibrium to optimum, social optimum. And we can see how you create asymmetricity. You can, when it's congested, when optimal, the social optimal is asymmetric, you can charge different admission price between the two originally same student dormitory. So even the Thunderbird and Iona, they have the same facility, same life condition. I intentionally maybe charge a higher rent for Thunderbird than Iona, or maybe charge a higher application fee for Thunderbird than Iona, right? Because I want to intentionally create asymmetricity. So that can be done, right? That's the optimal pricing.
The utility also multiplied.
That's a very good question. So you may say, oh, if you charge a price, yes, the customer have to pay that price. You have to deduct that price from their utility. Will they harm the social optimal? No, because usually we assume those pricing we could in turn return to the students, but in an equal way. So if I collect the $10 from you, $2 from you, I will return $6 to each. So this is basically like internal utility transfer. Overall, the utility will be the same. Okay, so and the social optimum for CUS is actually the same. Okay, so we will not spend too much time on that. Okay, and we could also talk about the revenue maximization. If your objective is really to maximize the revenue, I hope the student dormitory manager will not thinking that way. But if that's your objective function, for example, you want to collect the application fee from the students and you want to maximize this fee, not in the student dormitory, but in the service setting, that could be the case, right? In the service setting, you provide the two different type of service. Maybe that's what you want to consider. And we also show revenue maximization point is the same as a social optimal, right? And the revenue maximization price are also asymmetric. Okay, why it's still same as a social optimal? Because from the perspective, right? How you maximize the revenue? You need to charge money from the customers. How much money you can charge from the customer? It's exactly their surplus, the customer surplus. So maximize the consumer surplus and maximize the revenue are equivalent, right? So that's why revenue maximization point has the same structure as the social welfare maximization point. Right? They both actually, at a certain case, they may use asymmetric pricing. Okay, so that's so that completes our story for this very, maybe you could consider stylized setting, right? 2 symmetric server, 3 different types of queuing design. We agree that the setting is very stylized, right? You could ask a lot of challenging questions. Oh, why the 2 servers have the same speed? And why only 2 student dormitory, right? You could ask many questions, but the point is the results are very concise, right? And very neat, or we proved, right? In social welfare or revenue maximization, right? Always symmetricity is the best, right? And always single listing will maybe do better than multi-listing. Okay, but for social, if you want to maximize throughput rate, multi-listing is always the best. Right, so that's the takeaway message, which are very clear for the two server case. And now we try to extend this model. One reason, of course, you may expect the review asks, right? So do some extension. So we did some extension. So that's, I think, also interesting extension. Let's say there are not only 2 student dormitory. Indeed, the UBC now have many buildings, more buildings than only Iona House and student Thunderbird, right? I don't know how much University of Montreal has student dormitory options. Yeah, I think McGill has not many, but a few, right, for the undergraduate students, not for graduate students. Right? So let's say you have 10 different buildings, or n to be making the general, n different servers, but we still assume all the servers are symmetric. Okay. So then how you model customer choice? We can't have a horizontal line with 2 endpoints because now there are 10 endpoints, right? Or n 10 points. So basically we put them in a circle, right? This is called the setup circular model, right? So the customer are located. You still have a single parameter x, but you are located on this circular, right? So then your mismatch is measured by the distance from you and any server you try to, if you are served, okay, which serves you. Okay, so that's the utility model. Okay, and then you may ask how to model multi-listing, right? So this is set up a circular model, how you create a multi-listing queue. If you want to create many multi-listing queues, there are too many combinations. You could say, oh, server 4 and server 5, they have a multi-listing. Server 3 or server 4, you could check both, right? But if you do that, it's too complicated. And indeed, in the reality, it's not realistic. You let the student dormitory, the student dorm application forms allow customer students to check too many different checks, right? So we make assumption. Either you choose one of the n student dormitories, or you could just have a single check. I follow arrangement, which means if you check that, you might be offered to any student dormitory. But once you get offered, you cannot reject, you must go. Okay, so that's basically you have how many options now you have? You have n plus 2 options. Right? Why n plus 2? You could choose one of the n student dormitories, so you have n options. And you have the n plus 1 option to choose the multi-listing, which means you will join a queue that may give you any server in the end. And there, the last option, you cannot choose any queue. You could balk instead of joining this system. Right? So you have n plus 2 options. So given that, we can repeat our analysis. I know it's not a simple project because of now n is greater than 2. But we managed to deliver some result. We characterize the equilibrium, which is still symmetric. Okay? And we still show that the result, very important result, the throughput rate comparison. Still, we show the same, that the multi-listing is still the best. Multi-listing is still the best in terms to maximize throughput rate. So throughput, if you want to maximize throughput rate, still choose multi-listing. What about the social welfare? Originally, we show if n equals 2, single listing can do much better than multi-listing, because you don't want to accommodate everyone's needs. You want to discourage people from joining, right? That's the main insight. What about here? When n equals more than 2, we find a very interesting result. When n is an odd number, in some case, multi-listing and single listing can still be better than multi-listing, but the difference can be much smaller. In other words, if you have odd number, like 5, 7, 9 servers on the circular, then multi-listing is not that bad compared to when n is an even number. Well, people said, why that makes a difference, right? So that the difference is very interesting based on the topological structure, actually. if odd number, multi-listings performance will be much better when compared to when there's an even number. Like n equals 2, we know it's very bad. Right? N equals 4 is still bad. N equals 5 is much better. Why? Because if it's an odd number, you think about it, here's A, B, B, let's say, right? A, B, B. Because there's 3, n equals 3, let's say. What about those people between B and B? Previously, we said multi-listing is bad. Why? You remember the reason? Because those people, if they join the multi-listing queue, they will all have this equal utility. So therefore, when the system is congested, in the end, everyone's utility will go to 0, right? Because if there's a positive utility, some people will join. Okay? But now, if there is a third server here, their utility of joining the multi-listing will not be equal, right? Why is that not be equal? For people in the middle, for people to join to get the server from B and B, yes, those people will have the equal utility because it's half to half, right? No matter where they are, they're half to half. However, remember there's another server A. You have 1/3 chance to get B, 1/3 chance to B. You could have 1/3 chance to get A. Then for people here, the distance from that server is the largest. And for people in this point, the distance from A is much smaller. In other words, the utility, the overall utility for people here is the smallest. People here is larger because they are closer to that server, right? So the last server actually makes a huge impact. This, if its order is n equals 5, same. You have symmetry, B, but there's A left over. And this A is making a bigger difference because it creates heterogeneity. It creates differentiation in those people who, if they want to join the waitlist. And the differentiated valuation is all we want, you remember we said, right? If a customer have different variation, the society becomes better. Okay. So that's the main insight, that we find that for n equals order 5, multi-listing perform much better, and their distance between the distance you see is much smaller compared to single listing. Okay, so that's also another interesting result we find. And the last result, I think is maybe the most interesting result we find. Still, what's the social optimal? Originally, we show social optimal could be asymmetric when equals 2. Right? Now for big N, what will be the social optimal? We show that if N is a multiple of 4, so actually even order is not that matter. The magical number is 4. If N is a multiple of 4, then always there is a symmetric optimum. Always there is a symmetric optimum. So that actually is not a contradiction from our earlier result. Our earlier result said when n equals 2, there could be asymmetric optimum, right? The optimal point may be asymmetric. But now we show, because your n y true, right? If you make it 4 or multiple of 4, then always symmetric, the optimal is. Okay, so that I think completes our previous findings, right? So when n equals 2, there could be a symmetric optimal. What about n equals order 3 or 5, 7? We have to do numerical results, and we show that there could be symmetric, there could be asymmetric. So indeed, there could be a symmetric optimum, right? But sometimes it's always symmetric. So for all the number, both could have happened, right? But for n equal multiple of 4, we show that there's always a symmetric optimal. Okay. Okay, so that I think completes all our analytical results. So the main takeaway, right? We'll compare the 3 different mechanisms: single listing, pooling, and multi-listing. If the social object, if the planner, the manager is singly interested in throughput rate, then we always said multi-listing is the best. You should choose. However, if you care about the social welfare or revenue maximization, then single listing can sometimes beat multi-listing. When they can beat the multi-listing, if the system is congested and you have to scare people away, right? Then you will choose single listing. However, this difference will be much smaller when n is greater, when n is odd number, right? When you have an odd number of servers. And we also show when n, the social optimal, very interesting phenomenon, social optimal or revenue maximization point could be both asymmetric when n equals 2. because we want to intentionally create differentiated variation for the people who join the multi-listing queue, right? However, if n equals odd number, then you don't have to do anything. It's already as different. As the variation will already be differentiated because of the last server. Okay, and if n is a multiple of 4, we show social optimum is always asymmetric. Is always symmetric. Okay, so that I think concludes our works, and I think maybe there's still more work to do, right? Some people said, can you prove maybe the price of anarchy? I get one of the comments. Right, well, price of anarchy is more like you could compare the social optimal or the equilibrium optimal. What's the ratio of their total utility? Right, so there's still some I think future direction we could explore based on this model, because this multi-listing model now you can analyze with the derived closed form expression for the waiting times. And this is now the paper is on the minor revision of operations research. Hopefully it will forthcome soon. And thanks very much for being here. Thank you.
Daniel.